All right, everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into something that could really impact your daily life.
Definitely, yeah.
President-elect Trump's pick for Energy Secretary, Chris Wright.
Interesting choice.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of news articles here, and this guy's background is, well, let's just say it's not your typical Washington insider.
Not at all. Definitely not your typical energy secretary pick either.
Exactly.
Yeah, he's coming from the tech world.
Right.
And he's got experience across a surprising range of energy sectors.
Like what?
Well, nuclear, solar, geothermal.
Whoa, hold on.
And get this, even oil and gas.
Wow, so he's kind of worked across the board then.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's like he's been in every corner of the energy world.
And the articles are really highlighting his role as a pioneer of the American shale revolution.
That's right, that's right.
So before we even get into the potential impact of his appointment, can you give us a quick breakdown of what that revolution actually was?
Sure, yeah. So the shale revolution, or shale boom, as it's sometimes called,
Okay.
it was this period of really rapid growth in U.S. oil and gas production,
Right.
starting in the mid-2000s.
Oh, shit.
It was driven by new technologies,
Like,
like fracking, for example, which allowed companies to extract oil and gas from shale rock formations.
which, just to clarify for our listeners, was previously very difficult to access.
Exactly. And, think back to the early 2000s when gas prices were, they were just skyrocketing.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
And there were
yeah,
all these concerns about our reliance on foreign oil.
big time.
This boom really turned things around.
How so?
Well, it led to a pretty significant drop in energy prices, so made it cheaper for people to fill up their cars and heat their homes.
Okay, so cheaper gas and heating, that definitely sounds like something that would affect most people directly.
Absolutely.
But I also remember fracking being a pretty controversial topic.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So there were some downsides as well.
Yeah, while fracking does have its benefits, it also comes with potential risks.
Right.
And those risks often impact people living in communities near these drilling sites, most directly.
Yeah, it makes sense.
We're talking about concerns about things like groundwater contamination, increased seismic activity in some areas.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, and also the release of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas.
Okay, so cheaper gas and heating, but potential risks to the environment and communities near these drilling sites.
Right, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Now, let's bring it back to Chris Wright.
Sure.
What I find really interesting is that he's been quoted as saying there's no climate crisis,
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement.
which you can imagine has sparked quite a bit of debate,
For sure.
especially since that stance goes against, the overwhelming scientific consensus on climate change.
Totally. And what's important for listeners to understand is that, well, depending on how Wright approaches this issue,
Yeah?
it could mean changes in everything, from gas prices to investments in renewable energy to the types of environmental regulations we see.
So it's really up in the air then.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see how his views actually translate into policy.
So if you're someone who's been really trying to reduce your carbon footprint,
Yeah.
by investing in solar panels or driving a fuel-efficient car,
Uh-huh.
you might be wondering what this all means for you.
Right. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Now, the articles also highlight President-elect Trump's campaign promise of achieving U.S. energy dominance.
Yeah, big, powerful phrase there.
So can you break that down for us?
Well, U.S. energy dominance suggests a strategy that's really focused on maximizing domestic energy production. Let's
Okay.
call about things like ramping up oil and gas drilling, potentially reviving the coal industry, and decreasing our reliance on foreign energy sources.
So potentially even more of that shale revolution that we were just talking about.
Exactly.
And while that might sound appealing, in terms of energy independence and lower prices,
Sure. Yeah.
it also raises questions about the long-term environmental impact.
Right. And whether it aligns with global efforts to address climate change.
Right, so cheaper energy in the short term, but potentially at the expense of environmental sustainability.
Yeah, that's a pretty big trade-off.
Now, how does this tie into the creation of this National Energy Council that the articles keep mentioning?
It seems like this council is going to play a pretty key role in pushing forward this dominance agenda. They'll likely be focused on things like streamlining regulations, speeding up approvals for energy projects,
Yeah.
and generally just creating a more favorable environment for domestic energy production.
And we can't forget about the other key player in this, Lee Zeldin, the pick for EPA administrator.
Right.
The articles paint him as someone who's all about unleashing American business,
Yeah, another big, powerful phrase.
which seems to imply a lighter touch when it comes to environmental regulations, right?
Yes, and this is where things could get interesting. Because if the EPA loosens regulations on things like emissions from power plants or waste disposal from drilling operations,
Okay.
it could have tangible impacts on air quality and water quality in communities across the country.
So this isn't just some abstract political debate happening in Washington.
No, not at all.
These decisions could have very real consequences for people's health and well-being.
Exactly, exactly.
And that's why it's so important to understand what's at stake and how these policies might actually affect our everyday lives.
Absolutely, and that's what we're going to keep digging into.
All right, so we've got potential impacts on the environment, our personal health, and even our communities.
Yep, a lot to unpack here.
Let's zoom in on something that affects pretty much everyone on a daily basis.
Like what?
Gas prices.
Ah, yes, the ever-important gas prices.
If the Trump administration really ramps up domestic oil and gas production, could we see a return to those super low gas prices we saw a few years ago?
It's possible, but energy prices, they're influenced by a whole host of factors.
Yeah.
Global demand, geopolitical events, even speculation in the markets.
Okay, so it's complicated.
Yeah, it's not a simple cause and effect relationship.
So while increased production could put downward pressure on prices,
Yeah.
it's not a guarantee that we'll see a dramatic drop.
Right, so don't go trading in your fuel-efficient car for a gas guzzler just yet.
Uh-huh. Good advice.
And even if we do see lower gas prices,
Yeah.
we need to think about the long-term implications.
Like what?
Well, cheaper fossil fuels might seem appealing in the short term,
Of course.
but they could discourage investment in renewable energy
Yes.
and kind of delay the transition to a more sustainable energy future.
Gotcha. So short-term gains, but potential long-term consequences.
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure.
What about electricity bills?
Oh, yeah, those are important too.
They've been creeping up in a lot of
But
places.
they have, haven't they?
Could these energy appointments and policy shifts affect what we pay to keep the lights on?
Definitely. The type of energy sources we rely on to generate electricity has a direct impact on costs.
So if we see a shift back towards coal and natural gas,
Yeah.
it could lead to lower electricity prices in some areas.
At least initially, yeah.
But it's important to remember that those prices don't account for the hidden costs of fossil fuels.
Absolutely. Things like air pollution and climate change.
Right, which ultimately everyone pays for in some way.
Exactly. So while cheaper electricity might sound good in the short term, we need to consider those broader long-term implications.
So we've talked about potential impacts on the environment, gas prices, and now electricity bills.
Yeah, and it seems like this new administration's energy policies could touch pretty much every aspect of our lives.
Right, and with all these potential changes on the horizon, I think it's understandable if people are feeling a bit overwhelmed, maybe even a little powerless.
Yeah, I get that it can feel like these big policy decisions are happening way up there in Washington, far removed from our everyday lives.
So what can people do?
Well, that's a great question and one we're going to dive into next time.
Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back after the break.
Looking forward to it. It's not just about the environment either.
Okay.
We need to talk about the economic implications of this energy dominance strategy.
Because,
Well, because it's going to directly impact people's jobs and livelihoods.
right, when we hear all this talk about boosting oil and gas production or reviving the coal industry,
Yeah,
it's easy to think, oh, that means more jobs.
yeah. That's often the argument used.
Sure.
And it's true that those industries do create jobs.
Okay.
But what we also need to consider are the potential job losses in other sectors, particularly in the renewable energy industry, which has been growing rapidly in recent years.
So someone who's, say, built a career installing solar panels or working on wind farms,
Exactly.
this shift in priorities could be a real problem for them.
Absolutely. It's a complex equation,
Yeah.
and it's hard to predict how things will actually play out.
Of course.
But it's important to remember that these energy policy decisions,
Uh-huh.
they have ripple effects
Okay.
throughout the entire economy.
So if you work in the energy sector, or really any sector that's connected to energy,
Yeah,
you got to pay attention to these policy changes.
absolutely.
All right, so we've got potential impacts on jobs, the environment, our communities.
Yeah, a lot to think about.
Let's talk about something that affects pretty much everyone every single day.
Gas prices.
Exactly, gas prices.
Mm.
If the Trump administration really pushes for all this domestic oil and gas production, could we see a return to those super low gas prices we saw a few years ago?
It's possible, but it's not a simple answer.
Okay.
You see, energy prices are influenced by a bunch of different factors.
Like?
global demand, geopolitical events,
Okay.
even speculation in the markets.
So it's more than just how much oil and gas we're producing here.
Exactly. It's a global market.
While increased production could push prices down,
Yeah.
it's not a guarantee that we'll see a big drop.
Right. So don't trade in your fuel-efficient car just yet,
Ah, good point.
even if we do see lower gas prices.
Yeah.
We need to think about the long-term implications.
In what way?
Well, cheaper fossil fuels might seem great in the short term,
Right.
but it could discourage investment in renewable energy and slow down the transition to a more sustainable energy future.
So short-term gain, potential long-term pain.
Yeah, something like that.
What about electricity bills?
Oh, another big one.
They've been going up in a lot of places.
For sure.
Could these energy appointments and policy shifts affect what we pay to keep the lights on?
Definitely. The source of our electricity has a big impact on costs.
So more coal and natural gas could mean.
Potentially lower electricity prices, at least at first, but we can't forget about the hidden costs of fossil fuels,
Yeah.
pollution, climate change.
Right. Costs that everyone ends up paying for in some way.
Exactly. So cheaper electricity now might come with bigger costs later.
So we've talked about potential impacts on jobs, the environment, gas prices, electricity bills.
Yeah, and it seems like this new administration's energy policies could really impact our lives in a lot of ways.
With all these potential changes coming, it's understandable if people are feeling a bit overwhelmed,
Totally.
maybe even a little powerless.
Yeah, I get that. It can feel like we don't have much control over these big policy decisions.
So what can people do? Is there anything?
Well, I think the first step is to realize that we're not powerless.
Okay,
We might not be able to single-handedly change national energy policy,
sure.
but we can make choices in our own lives that make a difference.
Right.
And we can use our voices to advocate for change at the local and national level.
So it's not about feeling helpless, it's about finding ways to be proactive.
Exactly. It's about finding ways to, to take action, to make our voices heard.
So what are some practical things that people can do, in their everyday lives?
Well, one of the most impactful things, I think, is to really focus on reducing our own energy consumption.
Okay.
I know it might seem small, but when you think about it collectively, it can make a huge difference.
So what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, imagine, right, millions of people all across the country making a conscious effort to conserve energy
Okay.
in their homes, at work, even just how they get around.
Maybe some specifics.
Sure, yeah. So we're talking about things like switching to LED light bulbs, using energy-efficient appliances,
Okay, those make sense.
maybe carpooling more often, taking public transportation,
Right?
and don't underestimate, the power of just being more mindful about your energy use in general.
So, like what? Turning off lights when you leave a room?
Exactly. Unplugging devices when you're not using them, even washing your clothes in cold water.
Those do add up.
They do, and the great thing is, a lot of these energy-saving habits can actually save people money on their utility bills.
So it's good for the environment and good for your wallet.
Exactly, a win-win.
Now, you mentioned advocating for change at a broader level.
Yeah.
What does that look like? What can people actually do?
It could take a lot of different forms, You can start by supporting organizations that are working to promote clean energy, sustainable policies.
Okay.
You can contact your elected officials, let them know that you care about these issues.
So like writing letters, making phone calls.
Exactly, showing up at town hall meetings.
Okay.
And it's not just about national politics either. Get involved in your local community,
All right.
Go to city council meetings, support initiatives that are trying to promote energy efficiency and renewable energy in your town or city.
I think a lot of people get discouraged because they feel like, their individual actions are just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, I get it.
Especially when we're talking about these massive global issues like climate change.
I understand that feeling, but it's important to remember that, systemic change really does start with individual actions.
Okay.
Every time you make a sustainable choice, every time you speak up, you're contributing to a shift in mindset, a shift in the culture,
So it's not just about the immediate impact, it's about the ripple effect.
Exactly. The more people who are demanding sustainable solutions, the more pressure it puts on businesses and policymakers to respond.
Makes sense.
It creates this momentum that can lead to real change.
So even though there's a lot of uncertainty and, potential setbacks, we're not powerless.
No, not at all.
We have a role to play in shaping this future,
Absolutely.
both through our own choices and, our collective actions.
Exactly. And that's really the key takeaway I hope our listeners, are walking away with here.
Right.
We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to solve this. We all have a stake in this,
Right.
and we all have the power to make a difference.
Well, that's a great note to end on.
It is.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of energy policy.
It's been a pleasure.
And for helping us all understand what this means for our lives.
Anytime.
It's definitely complex, but hopefully we've shed some light on the key issues and, maybe even give you the tools to navigate the changes that are ahead.
That's the goal.
And to all of our listeners, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking questions because ultimately the future of energy is in our hands.
That's right.